Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Anbiya'i wal Mursaleen, wa ala alihi wa ahlihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. First of all, I would like to thank Tazkia University College for inviting me to speak on this topic, which is of immense importance, not only to Islamic banking and finance, but for the wider world as well. The difficult times we are passing through, i.e. COVID-19 affected time, this is going to change our lives irreversibly, our social lives, our family lives, our individual lives. And of course, this is going to change the institutions in which we work. And given that I have only 30 minutes, I would like to share very briefly the historical perspective of the external shocks. I would like to start with the Great Depression of the 1930s. It was definitely a very significant external shock to the economies of the world and of course the global economy of that time, following which a lot of changes took place in the world. One significant change was a number of well-established business families went out of the business and they were replaced by a new generation of families and businesses and corporates which dominated the world afterwards. The second external shock, which was even bigger than the Great Depression shock, was the World War II. Actually, after the World War II, a number of new institutions emerged, which changed our lives in a very radical way. The Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, were actually set up after the World War II to restructure the global economy. And all of us, we know that these institutions are playing very significant roles in the lives of the nations. And of course, through this national perspective, they have affected and they continue to affect the lives of the institutions and individuals as well. That was the time when even NATO was set up. In 1944, IMF and World Bank were set up, and towards the end of that decade, 1948-49, NATO was set up as well. Then we had another important external shock, which was the oil shock of 1970s. And this shock is important and is of significance to Islamic banking and finance because many would argue that Islamic banking and finance actually emerged out of that external shock. Although before the 1970s, some Islamic financial institutions were set up, but in 1975, when the Islamic Development Bank was set up as a multilateral institution, and of course, some commercial institutions like Dubai Islamic Bank in 1975 was set up, 1977, 1979, a number of Islamic banks were set up in different parts of the world. So for the Islamic world, I would say that the external shock of the 1970s was very important, after which a lot of new developments took place. Following that, we have been facing some minor external shocks. The latest one before the COVID-19 was the great financial crisis of 2008-2009, which affected the global financial markets in a significant way. And of course, Islamic banking and finance was not an exception. There was a definite change in the way we would do Islamic banking and finance following the great financial crisis of 2008-2009. Then towards the end of the second decade of this century, we experienced something which is very unique in its nature. This is a truly global external shock. It has affected not just one sector. It hasn't affected just banks or other financial institutions, it has affected the whole society, global society. It has affected businesses, and within businesses, it has affected manufacturing sectors, services sectors, health sector, you name anything. We have been hit by this tsunami in a very comprehensive way, and no one can claim to have remained unaffected by this. And of course, Islamic banks and financial institutions are facing the brunt like any other financial institution in the world. Having said that, this time, at least up to now, the banking and finance sector has not been very significantly affected by the ongoing crisis. Of course, there are negative effects of this everywhere, and banking and finance cannot say that, oh, we are completely separate from this one. When I say that banks and financial institutions have not been affected significantly so far by the pandemic, I refer to the profitability figures of banks and financial institutions, including Islamic banks and financial institutions. Last year, which was the peak year of the crisis, at the end of the year, a lot of Islamic banks, they actually reported increase in their profits. And in some cases, the profits were very significant. This year, I have been speaking to a number of the CEOs of Islamic banks and financial institutions. Of course, they are nervous. Like myself, I am in Islamic banking and finance. And as a business person, I am nervous. And there is an effect, negative effect on my business. But we are surviving. Okay. I was talking to one friend of mine who runs a bank in United Kingdom. And he told me that last year, during the lockdown, they managed to meet all their targets. And this year, we are towards the end of the first half of the year. Again, he said that although the restrictions are in place, but we have managed to perform as per expectations of our shareholders. Right? So this is the story of banks and financial institutions in general. However, there are some sectors which are affected very badly. Airlines industry, for example, the giants like Emirates Airlines, Singapore Airlines, British Airways, and you must have got the news of Garuda defaulting on the payments of one of the sukuk. So the real sector of the global economy, it is definitely very badly affected by the pandemic. And it's not only the airlines. I've just given you one example. The wider hospitality sector, hotels, for example, if no one is traveling, if no one is allowed to travel, how these hotels are going to operate. So hotels industry is in a big problem. And when they open up, I believe that the exact magnitude of the problem would be known to us. Similarly, from London, I can give you example of the shared offices industry. Just before the crisis, in the city of London, about 20 billion worth of new investment was made into the shared office facilities. All those buildings, these tall buildings, they are empty. They do not have any business. But on top of that, maintaining those buildings, it has become an issue. Now, if I go to the food industry, first half of the crisis, food industry was actually quite okay. Restaurants, cafes, they managed to not only maintain, but actually they got more business from their takeaway businesses. However, in the United Kingdom, now that we are towards the end of the lockdown, cafes and restaurants have opened up. But the owners, they're very nervous because they have to follow the SOPs. If in one restaurant, the full capacity was 100 individuals, 100 people, now because of the SOPs, they can take only half of the capacity, 50 individuals. And of course, this has profit implications for these businesses. Some of the very well-established businesses like Debenhams. Debenhams was a high street name in the United Kingdom. It has gone out of the business. It has gone bankrupt. I have seen with my eyes Debenhams closing down. Okay, and I have seen people crying. Some people, they had been working for Debenhams for last 20 years, 25 years. And when I saw them, that was their last day at work. So this is the picture. It's a very gloomy picture of the real sector of the economy. And banks and financial institutions, they cannot remain completely separate from this one. The governments, especially in the Western side of the world, in the OECD countries, in Europe, America, and other developed countries, they have pumped a lot of money into the system. And because this money has been pumped into the system through banks, banks have been beneficiaries. Okay. However, when they resume their real business with the market players, banks would be in very difficult situations as well. And Islamic banks, they would not be an exception. Now, the question is, what would be the life like in Islamic banking and finance post-COVID? My simplest answer to this is that Islamic banks and financial institutions would not be very different from their conventional counterparts. My hunch is that the financial sector would adjust itself very quickly. We may not find a lot of difficulties in the financial sector, including in Islamic banking and finance. But that should not be taken as a good news. Okay. I think what is the intent of our today's webinar is to see what role Islamic banking and finance can play in the post-COVID era to make itself more effective and more relevant to the lives of the people it has been attempting to serve. People like me, we are inside the industry. We know that the global Islamic financial services industry has prospered and grown significantly. There are some estimates that by the end of this year, the industry would be touching the size of $3 trillion US. Okay, and the growth prospects are good as well. And the industry has behaved almost in the same way as conventional banking and finance industry. And there has been some criticism of this one as well. If Islamic banking was supposed to behave like conventional banking, some critics would say, what was the point of introducing this new way of doing banking and finance? The advocates, people like me, we would say that this is a Sharia compliant version of what is impermissible otherwise. Hence, there is a value addition. But the critics would say that, what is the economic value proposition? The whole Islamic banking and finance industry emerged out of social justice concerns. Now, in the 1950s and 60s and even 70s, the scholars would say that Islamic banking and finance model would be more just, it would be more inclusive, and it would serve the people in a lot better way as compared to the interest-based banks and financial institutions. It hasn't happened in the sense that Islamic banks and financial institutions have served the industry as much as conventional banks and financial institutions, but it has so far failed to bring the new value addition. It's not a new model. It is a Sharia compliant version of the existing model. So I think COVID-19 may be relevant in the context of reforming Islamic banking and finance to make it more socially responsible. And I must say that in the last 18 months, there is a huge emphasis on recognizing the role of Islamic social finance during this crisis, and of course, afterwards as well. So in the post-COVID-19 era, Islamic social finance globally would have to play a bigger role. Now, as I mentioned, the global size of the Islamic financial services industry, the mainstream Islamic financial services industry, is about $3 trillion US. Now, there is a need to come up with new institutions which would be consistent with the new socio-economic reality in the world. Islamic banks and financial institutions, they have followed a corporate model, which is good. Whatever they have been doing there, I would not like to criticize because I have been part of this movement. However, now there is a need to come up with a new model of Islamic finance, which should be based on the principles of Islamic social finance. When we talk about Islamic social finance, we must keep in mind an institutional framework. When we talk about Islamic banks, this banking institution is in the center of the whole thing. In Islamic social finance, the institution which must be in the middle of everything is the institution of Waqf. And this is the time for the stakeholders in Islamic banking and finance to start thinking about creating Islamic social finance Waqf or social finance Waqfs, SFWs. And there should be a very comprehensive framework around them. Indonesia is playing a lead role. We already have this framework, which is called the Core Principles for Effective Management and Supervision of Waqf, which was developed with the help of Islamic Development Bank. And this was actually inaugurated in Indonesia. So that document is there. There is a need to work on it and make it more comprehensive. Right now, we have 4 or 5 infrastructure bodies for Islamic banking and finance. We have Accounting and Auditing Organization for Islamic Financial Institutions. We have IFSB, we have IIFM, and we have the likes of IRA, Islamic International Rating Agencies, or some people would say the 5th one is International Islamic Liquidity Management Corporation as well. So these 4 or 5 infrastructure bodies are there. There is a need to come up with a similar infrastructure body, global one, for promoting Awqaf all over the world. We have some framework, like within Islamic Development Bank, we have Awqaf Properties Investment Fund, APIF or APIF. This is a fund within the Islamic Development Bank group. But I believe that there is a need to come up with a global body which should be completely independent of existing infrastructure bodies. Okay, like we can have global Waqf organization or global Waqf development board, something like this one. And I think in this respect, Indonesia can play a very important role. Indonesian government has been serious about promoting Islamic banking and finance in the country and taking it to the next level. KNEKS, for example, which was set up by the President, His Excellency Joko Widodo. This is an excellent development in a national context, but a person like me would like to suggest for the Indonesians to come up with a global body. Okay, it might be called Islamic Social Financial Services Board, which should be based in Jakarta. Why Indonesia? Indonesia is a very interesting story in Islamic banking and finance. When we look at the Middle Eastern Islamic banking and finance market, this is a very elitist kind of segment of the global industry. Because in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, Qatar, and these smaller GCC countries, poverty is not a big issue. Okay, hence these guys, they would not be developing products for poverty alleviation, women empowerment, financial inclusion, etc. Okay. In a country like Indonesia, where wider socio-economic problems are widespread, okay, hence we see that a lot of institutions, social finance institutions, are already in existence. We have Baitul Mal wa Tamwil, we have rural banks, I'm talking about Islamic, and we have even takaful companies, we have the mainstream banks offering microfinance in a big way, BTP and Sharia, I am aware of them. They play a very important role in the promotion of Islamic microfinance products or financial inclusion products, the products targeting women empowerment, etc. I am giving one example, but there are so many other examples as well. We have the likes of Basnas. Basnas is, although this is a national body, but it's playing a bigger role. It has emerged as a global player or an Indonesian player with global relevance. So a lot of social finance activities are already going on, and there is a need to spread the scope of these activities to other parts of the world as well. And Indonesia can play the lead role in this respect. So this Waqf financial institution, social finance, Waqf, SFWs. In Malaysia, for example, when I go there, all the companies, they would have SDN.BHD. At the end. Okay, so basically limited companies. So if we can come up with a framework which could distinguish the Waqf companies, Waqf institutions, Waqf entities, by way of putting at the end SFW. So this would mean that this is a different kind of business. This is a social business recognized in the law. Okay. And then spreading it all over the world. If there is this SFW at the end, people would understand that this is a different kind of financial/business model. So there is a need, I think, to come up with this kind of new model of practicing Islamic banking or Islamic finance in the world. This would be very new to the world. So far, Islamic banking and finance has been doing what conventional banks and financial institutions have already been doing in a non-Sharia way. So the contribution of Islamic banking and finance is that it has Islamized the banking and finance business, which has relevance in the societies and the economies where Islamic banks and financial institutions are operating. Now there is a need to come up with this new institution. This new institution would have this social objective in mind. So number one objective would be to meet the social objectives. And when we refer to social objectives, of course, implicitly, we are saying that these institutions would be not-for-profit. Banks, okay, they are for-profit organizations, including Islamic banks. Takaful companies, for example, most of them, almost all of them, they are for-profit entities. What I'm referring to is this new model of Islamic finance, which is number one, social oriented, number two, no profit motive. And of course, when you have these three things, operating model would be completely different as well. And this would change the use of a number of Islamic modes of financing. For example, murabaha in a banking context is a very different kind of animal. In most of the countries where Islamic banks use murabaha, they use a very complicated structure. Banks would not like to be directly involved in trading. There are some examples where banks are actually directly involved in trading, but most Islamic banks, they would like to offer trade financing. Trade financing means what? I need a car. And the bank would, if the bank is using murabaha, the bank would buy the car from a vendor and would sell it to me on profit. And the way this whole thing would work, bank would actually not come into the picture. I might be appointed as an agent for the bank to buy the car on behalf of the bank and then selling it to myself, serving as an agent for the bank and buying it for myself. It's a complicated structure. Now, if we come up with this social finance kind of model of Islamic finance, in that case, this murabaha would be actually the trade murabaha. A lot of social finance, these SFWs, would be involved in trading. They would have the trading establishments owned by them. So if I would need a car, I would go to this car dealership, which would be owned by an social finance Waqf, SFW. Okay, and of course, whatever surplus that Waqf would be keeping to itself, that would be not used for any shareholders because there won't be any shareholders, but that money would be used for the benefit of the beneficiaries. In my view, there is a huge amount of money available for this kind of activities. So it's not only when we refer to Waqf, of course, okay, we refer to Waqf as a body. Within this, we can have the sadaqat. Okay, we can even, now cash Waqf has become very well known. Okay, this concept was not very well known about 50 years back, for example, but now a lot of banks and other financial institutions, they are practicing cash Waqf. So this money coming into the framework in the form of cash Waqf, in the form of what I call temporary donations, plus sadaqah, okay, well, the permanent donations. This amount, sadaqat, if the charity is organized by these SFWs in a coherent way, there are a lot of trillions available worldwide. This segment of Islamic finance could be more than 3 trillion US dollars if this is organized. If we take a view, for example, on the Waqf properties in the Muslim world, these properties, as of now, they are underdeveloped. But if they are developed, the value, global value of the Waqf properties runs into millions or into trillions. And this is something which the advocates of Islamic finance should be looking into. This is the time for us to start looking into developing a new model, which should be more authentic, which should be more relevant, and of course, this should have a better value proposition for the economies and the societies in the world. Okay, so I think this is absolutely important for Islamic finance to come up with something similar to this one to keep itself relevant to the needs of the people in the post-COVID era. In the post-COVID era, income disparities are going to take a very different kind of shape. Till the 2019, the global institutions like World Bank and IMF as well, United Nations and other multilateral institutions, regional development banks like Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, and of course our own Islamic Development Bank has been involved in poverty eradication. Poverty eradication, the reference has always been to this base level poverty, okay, absolute poverty. At the same time, there has been an emphasis on relative poverty as well, i.e. reducing income disparities. COVID-19 is definitely going to accentuate income disparities in the world, which means the relative poverty is going to increase. And of course, there are some indications that the levels of absolute poverty in a number of countries is going to rise as well. During the crisis, people's income levels have gone down, and some people would say that this is temporary. even if it's temporary, this will take time for a number of individuals, families, and the communities to go back to the pre-COVID income levels. And this means that the income disparities would be a lot more as compared to the previous era. And Islamic financial institutions would have to play a role. Okay. There are some indications that the existing Islamic financial institutions, they have started looking into the possibilities of using certain tools. And I must commend the role of Islamic Development Bank in this context. They have rolled out a new Sukuk program, which would raise a lot of money. It has raised already a lot of money. Okay, it has actually come up with it issued the largest green Sukuk issued by a multilateral institution. And this is not going to be just one-off. There is this huge program every now and then. Whenever there is a need, Islamic Development Bank has this intention of raising more money to be used for meeting the requirements of Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Okay, which is very consistent with what is going to happen in the context of COVID-19 as well. The governments, they have come up with their own COVID response programs. Okay, in Indonesia, there has been movements in this respect, neighboring Malaysia as well, and so many other countries. The national governments have come up with their own COVID response strategies and programs. When I look at, apart from Islamic Development Bank, okay, when I look at the Islamic banking and finance industry, we find that there are very small kind of initiatives and activities taking place in this respect. And one should not expect that these Islamic banks would come up with COVID response related products. No. They are profit-oriented institutions, and they would continue the way their conventional counterparts would be doing the business in the market. So then this new kind of institution, which I have mentioned, that has a very important role to play. Now, also, I think for the mainstream, so this is the new kind of thing I have mentioned. The existing Islamic banks and financial institutions, they would have to respond to the changes in the economic reality in an adequate fashion as well. I believe that COVID has changed our lives irreversibly in many respects. From now on, there would be a lot more emphasis on virtual reality. And me and you guys would be required to come up with your virtual reality as well. What do we mean by that? Basically, if this is my physical profile, and in some cases, youngsters, okay, they come up with a Facebook account, a Twitter account, another social media account, which is a fake one. This is me, Humayon Dar, and I might have a Facebook account in the name of someone else. Maybe if I'm naughty, I might be pretending to be a woman. Okay. In future, however, this dichotomy of physical profile and virtual profile would not be possible. Because whatever I do physically, privately, this is going to be recorded. It has already started. Okay. This is going to be recorded virtually. And more importantly, this is going to be exhibited virtually as well. So whatever my hand would be doing privately, this would be known socially as well. Islamic banks and financial institutions, they must take into account these developments in what we call artificial intelligence and new versions of this one. So we call it AI, maybe okay, there would be something more advanced than this one. So Islamic banks and financial institutions, okay, they would have to accept this new reality. Okay, and of course, okay, all of us as individuals, we will have no option but to accept it. Okay, and given this new normal we have been talking about, okay, last 18 months we were talking about this new normal. That new normal has started emerging, which has its advantages and it has disadvantages as well. Islamic banks and financial institutions, they would have to assess these advantages and disadvantages and change themselves accordingly. So there will be a kind of internal reform within Islamic banks and financial institutions. In addition to that, there is a need to come up with a new model of Islamic financial intermediation around the concept of Waqf. So for me, Waqf should play a more prominent role in the post-COVID-19 era. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.